Hello, welcome back to the Fruit of Grisaia. After that, we were divided between a group collecting things from the bus and a group responsible for sorting those items and preparing to erect our tents. We set about our work in silence. I was assigned to the collection team because of my sturdy physique, which meant I was stuck with the job of crawling into the overturned bus and dragging out whatever luggage I could find. The work itself wasn't that difficult in the physical sense, but inside the bus, the bodies of the two girls who had died instantly were still left untouched. And every time I passed by, I couldn't help but see resentment in their faces. Chewing my lower lip, I forced out the willpower to go on. Although I wasn't conscious of it, a strain on my nerves built with every trip. Finally, the dim interior of the bus was all but emptied of luggage, with the exception of the personal belongings of the dead. Probably because I'd passed the corpses so many times now, I had grown somewhat used to their expressions of bitter regret, or maybe it would be more accurate to say that my emotions had been paralyzed. And so, I joined my hands before the body of Shikanai Tsukasa, my senior by 2 years. Whispering, I'm sorry, I talked to Kazuki when I pulled her luggage free.
急に大きな声を出さないでちょうだい。耳が切なくなるわ。かずみさん。びっくりした。急に声をかけ。急ではない声のかけ方ってあるの？なんなの？何か用？手が空いたから死体から私物を剥ぎ取るのを手伝いに来たのよ。その言い方はどうだろう。どうせ聞こえちゃいないわよ。
As she spoke, Kazuki gently closed Shikanai Senpai's eyelids.
もう一体は？あっち2年の小沢先輩。小沢？ああ、自己管理のできていない体型をした人ね。どうして素直に太ってるって言わないの？そんなことを言ったら彼女が傷つくじゃない。どうせ聞こえちゃいないわよ。まあ、なんて罰当たりな。あなたがそれを言う？私は毎週日曜日の朝には本当に？そうか。もう遅いわよ。デブの先輩は私に任せて、あなたはその荷物持って外に。デブって。
Kazuki was a truly elusive person. At times she reversed herself with dizzying speed, had she seen that I was depressed and turned to this black humor to make me smile.
あ、そういえば。さっきはどうして急に部長に反論を？あんなの予定になかったじゃない。ああ、あれね。あなた、あの時の部長見たけど。あなたの口から状況説明を聞いているうちは良かったのだけれど、あなたが会話の主導権を握り始めた途端に不機嫌な顔になったのよ。だから、あの人がおかしな反発意識を持つ前に、私が反論してみせたのよ。私が口を挟めば、あの人は当然噛みついてくるだろうし、その上で私を言いまかしたとなれば、しばらくは機嫌も良くなるだろうしね。じゃあ、わざと？もしあの場で私が口を挟まなければ、食べ物が心もとなくなる3日後ぐらいには音を上げて、脱出しましょうと言い出すかもしれないでしょ。でも、私の意見を押しのけて通した意見を覆すとなれば、私の意見が正しかったと認めることになる。
The captain's obstinacy toward Kazuki had become a powerful reason for her to keep us where we were.
そこまで考えて。長いスパンで見れば、負けることで得る利益もあるということよ。こんな状況では一瞬先の自分すら想像できないかもしれないけれど、10日後の自分を想像して行動しなさい。私、あなたのそばにいると息が詰まりそうだわ。そう？でも短くもたった一度の人生よ。一人ぐらい天才と知り合いになっておくのも悪くないわよ。天才って
っていうか、自分で
人に言われると腹が立つけどね。あなただって人にバカだと言われれば腹は立つのに、自分のことを私バカだからと言って相手を油断させるでしょ。
実際バカだもの。
あら、あなたはバカじゃないわよ。本当のバカっていうのはね、天才。
私たちって確かお友達だったよね。
ええ、そう。あなたのそういう頭の回転の速さは私気に入って。
恐縮です。
What the heck? Jeez, seriously. I must be something like a toy to her. I did feel discomfort at the effortless control she had over me, but I'm sure Kazuki knew as well as I did that I wouldn't oppose her in the end. That realization was irritating in its own right, but truthfully, by this point, I'd gotten myself so aggravated that I felt like smiling instead. Giving a loud sigh of surrender, I turned my attention back to stripping the dead girl of her possessions. It took an hour to retrieve all the camping gear and personal belongings from the overturned bus. But now we had to face a difficult question. What do we do about the two bodies still in the bus? That was the problem. Somebody raised the idea of having everybody carry them out together, but considering the cramped interior of the bus, it would be impossible for all of us to participate. Someone else suggested that we should leave them be, rather than clumsily dragging them around, but at Kazuki's words, "It's hot today, isn't it? How long does it take for a corpse to begin rotting, I wonder?" That idea was instantly abandoned. Finally, everyone gathered there fell silent. Our pleading glances settled on the only man present, Mr. Ochi. And after a few minutes, when he placed his hands on his knees and stood with the words, "I'll do it," every one of us breathed a sigh of pure relief. Having entered the overturned bus alone, Mr. Ochi emerged with Shikanai's body cradled in his arms. The only ones who witnessed that moment were Kazuki, Captain Sakashita, and me. The others cast their eyes to the ground or turned away, avoiding the sight of their acquaintance's corpse. Probably because that sight was the distillation of a piteous reality. To see that moment would have meant facing the truth they wanted so desperately to forget. To be honest, when I was collecting luggage from the bus, I had placed a hand on Shikanai's body with the thought of carrying it outside. Startled to learn exactly how cold a human body could become when its blood stopped flowing, I withdrew my hand instantly. I hadn't felt this kind of shock when I touched my grandmother's body in the casket at her funeral. Grandma's death, which I'd known would come eventually, wasn't nearly that cold to the touch. Touching this girl's death, a death I couldn't view with composure or resignation, turned my spine to ice. I didn't ever want to feel that way, ever again. Watching the removal of the bodies in solemn silence, I reflexively brought my hands together and began to pray for the dead. From behind my back, I could hear whispering voices. That body, what do we do with it now? Buried somewhere, I guess? Can we just do that when we're rescued? Won't her family be mad? We can't assume help will arrive right away. We can't just leave it like this. It's summer, after all. Natsu. Apparently sensing our anxiety, Mr. Ochi decided to bury the three bodies some ways away. At the very least, it wouldn't do to leave them where we could see them. Practically speaking, if we'd watched those corpses rot before our eyes, we would have put our mental health at risk. In a situation like this one, panic is the greatest enemy. For the same reason, we decided it would be best if none of us acted alone. We paired off into units of two. To put things nicely, the idea was to establish a dynamic of mutual support. But when you got to the heart of the matter, we were supposed to watch each other like hawks for signs of abnormal behavior. If one member of the pair caused a problem, both would be held responsible. Well, I'd been 80% sure it would turn out this way from the moment I'd heard about the rule. Kazami Kazuki named me her partner, the look on her face saying it was the most natural thing in the world.
Toいうわけだから、これからもよろしくね。
As she spoke, Kazuki moved to show me her left arm, now wrapped in a sling. Her meaning was clear enough. My arm was disabled thanks to you, so it's only natural that you pick up the slack for me, right? I didn't have any objection to acting as a unit with Kazuki. Judging from her words and actions so far, she was intelligent and knowledgeable. If I followed her lead, things shouldn't go wrong. Even so, I couldn't quite repress my feelings. Something like dissatisfaction, or maybe confusion. Above all, I was tired of dancing so obediently on her strings.
いじめ目的以外で私を選んだ理由があるのなら聞かせてもらえないかな。
いじめるために選んだのよ。文句があるなら聞いてあげる。対処はしないけれど。
それって言うだけ無駄じゃない。
ストレスは減るわよ。長生きしようと思ったら溜め込まない方がいいわ。特に今のような状況ではね。
ああ、そう。
他に何か質問は？
私をいじめて楽しい？
不思議。どうして聞きたくもない答えを聞きたがるのかしら。はっきりと言葉にしないと興奮しないタイプ？言いにくいから遠回しに言うけど、あなた神聖の魔女よ。
聞くんじゃなかったわ。
大丈夫。私は神聖のサディストだから、きっとうまくいくわ、私たち。
With those words, Kazuki held out her uninjured right arm toward me. Unable to immediately understand the meaning of her gesture, I stared blankly back into her face.
あなたも手を出してくれないと、私一人では握手はできないわ。
そうか、握手ね。風見さんに握手なんて一般的な概念があったことに驚いた。
私のことは和樹さんでいいわ。あなたのことはあまねちゃんでいい。
うん。
それじゃ改めてよろしくね、あまねちゃん。
こちらこそよろしく、和樹ちゃん。
I gripped Kazuki's outstretched hand with as much force as I could muster. Her hand was so small, it felt like I could quite literally crush it if I squeezed hard enough. And yet, even then, when all I could see ahead of us was uncertainty and danger, I had the feeling that small hand would save me. Striding her way to an unsteady foothold above us, the captain shouted in a voice that resounded off the walls of rock. At her feet, the food and camping equipment we had dragged out of the bus were piled in a heap.
テントは2人で1つ、寝袋は1人に1つ。食料はとりあえず3日分を配給します。決して十分な量とは言えませんが、各自節約を心がけ、3日間持たせること。
In the dark cloud of bad luck that it was our bus accident, our meager silver lining of good fortune was that we had been returning from a camping trip. Among the luggage we collected from the bus, there was a variety of camping equipment, as well as leftover ingredients from the meal we'd made the day before. There were 4 tents designed for 3 occupants, and 1 large tent made for 6. Kazuki and I took one of the smaller tents, 2 sleeping bags, and a mat for both of us. Our rations for the 3-day period were distributed to us in a garbage bag.
現在17時14分。18時までにテントの設営を済ませ、18時半には各自夕食を済ませてください。 それ以降は自由時間としますが、勝手な行動をとって周囲に迷惑をかけないようにしてください。わかりましたか？
As she spoke, the captain glanced briefly around the group, then brought her gaze to a halt on Kazuki, who was standing at my side. That last understood was probably directed at her in particular. Did she not notice Captain Sakashita's hostile attitude? Did she notice and play dumb on purpose? Whatever the case.
はーい。
Kazuki answered in a high-pitched girly tone that seemed to originate from her nose.
やあね、何をあんなにピリピリしているのかしら。
風見さん、そんな声出せたんだ。気持ち悪。
もう、あなたまでそんなことを言うの？別に嫌いな子にどう思われようとなんとも思わないけど、あなたにまでそんな風に思われたら私だって傷つくのよ。
あ、ごめんなさい。
じゃあ罰としてあなたがテントを張ってくださる？
もともとそのつもりだったし。
代わりに夕食の準備は私がします。やったことはないけど。食材は人参に玉ねぎにじゃがいも。これって明らかに昨日作ったカレーの食材の余りよね。カレー粉もあるけど少ないわね。
待って貴重な食材なのよ。大丈夫なの？
まあ料理なんて煮るか焼くか蒸すかでしょ。きっと簡単よ。
いい私がやるから任せて。
でもあなたにはテントを。
いいのよ。私こう見えても一応実家が料理屋だから料理にはちょっと自信ある。
そう？でもなんか悪いわ。あなたばかり働く。
じゃあテントを張り終わったら一緒に料理しましょう。手伝ってくれる？
ああ、それはいいわね。なんだか仲のいいお友達って感じで。
でしょ？
ところであなた、お塩を使わない料理ってできる？
どういう意味？
言葉の通りだけれど。
お塩ならあるじゃない。ほら。
だからそれをできるだけ使わないでほしいのだけれど。無理？
まあ無理ではないけど、お塩がないと美味しくないよ。
その辺は我慢しましょうね。
いいけど。
After erecting our tent, I gave saltless cooking a try as Kazuki requested. Cooking the onions in a fry pan, I mixed them with smashed steamed potatoes and flavored the mix with pepper, then molded into an oval and baked it in butter, pretty much making it up as I went along. What would you even call this thing? A potato burger? A crochet without meat or sauce? Anyway, kind of an unorthodox result. Although I was frankly a little wary myself, it was pretty good when I actually ate it, and Kazuki also happily praised the taste. By some mysterious psychological process, I found that Kazuki's praise motivated me to try hard next time as well. Ridiculous as it may sound, I'm fairly sure I was beginning to genuinely like this girl named Kazami Kazuki. When the sun set, the sultry heat and humidity of the day vanished quickly, giving way to a chilly night. Nonetheless, I hadn't entered my tent yet. My agitation from this overwhelming barrage of events hadn't yet cooled, so I wasn't exactly sleepy. And I think I may have still been slightly resistant to the idea of entering a tent alone with Kazami Kazuki. When I looked up, there was a slight sliver of moonlight working its way to us through a gap in the treetops. Amidst the darkness at the bottom of the ravine, I could just make out the dome shapes of our tents here and there. The only one in which a light was burning was the largest tent. That 6-person tent was occupied by a riser, Mr. Ochi, along with the wounded Hirooka-san and Sakurai-san. The dim light of a lantern projected the movements of the inhabitants as shadows on the wall, and an agonized moaning leaked from inside. It was a voice like that of a damned soul crawling through hell. Probably Hirooka-san and her fractured legs. When Kazuki went to check on her after dinner, Hirooka-san had been bathed in greasy sweat. The entire time we were there, she kept up a low, groaning cry, never managing coherent speech. Fractures had given rise to an agonizing fever. She had no method of coping with her suffering except to scream and moan. Knowing that we had to get her to a hospital as soon as possible, I also knew that we had been placed in circumstances where we could do nothing but wait for help. Frustrated impatience boiled up inside me. The food distributed to us by the captain's orders was to last 3 days, which meant that at the very best she intended to have us spend 3 days here. But what was to come after that? What happened if 3 days passed and no one arrived to save us? As worsening tremors of anxiety crawled their way up my spine, I shivered for reasons unrelated to the temperature of my body. Our bus had fallen. Some of us had already died, but even so, something in the core of my mind seemed to be anesthetized against that truth. None of it felt fully real. That sense of numbness was what frightened me the most. What should we do? How do we survive this? No matter how frantically I tried to find answers, my mind was paralyzed, dominated by a single thought. We can't do anything. What will be, will be. As if rejecting the hopeless situation it had found itself in, my brain was simply refusing to think. That refusal of reality may have been a common phenomenon among us that night. From some other tent in that area, I heard the incongruous sound of brightly laughing voices. That laughter grated badly on my nerves. I couldn't help but turn my head toward the sound in irritation. Perhaps Kazuki, sitting next to me, felt the same way. As she likewise turned her gaze toward the laughter, there was a scowl on her face.
ねえ、風見さん。
和樹でいいわ。そう言ったと思うけど。何あまね。
あなたは今何を考えているの？
別に何も。本を読んでいたところよ。
本？
There was nothing in Kazuki's hands. Even if there had somehow been a book there, it would have been impossible to read in the darkness.
あなたにはまだ言ってなかったかしら。私ね、一度見た本の内容を絵として頭に記憶しておいて、後から文字として認識することで好きな時に読むことができるの。
え？ごめん、意味がわからない。どういうこと？
つまり、開いた本のページをカメラで撮影して、後でその写真を見ることで内容を読むことができる。そういえばわかりやすいかしら？私の頭の中にはまだ読んでいない本が144冊残っていたから、そのうちの
What the heck was I supposed to say to that? Could the geniuses of the world all do things like this? No, that was the wrong way to look at it. It's probably precisely when you can do something so utterly removed from the capabilities of other people that you deserve to be called a genius. I was confident there was simply no way I could ever pull off something like that, no matter how well she explained it to me.
何の本を読んでいたの？
地震で倒壊した学園の中に取り残された15人の男女学生を描いたフィクションノベル。
へえ。
閉鎖空間に取り残された学生という設定が今の私たちの状況に近いし、何かの参考になるかと思って読んではみたけれど、ダメね。あまり有用な情報は得られなかったわ。
On the point of asking about the ending of that novel, I abruptly clamped my mouth shut. Even without asking, I had a rough idea. Most likely, the students in that story were wiped out. That was probably the exact reason Kazuki had vaguely described it as not particularly useful. Kazuki turned her face to me with a sleepy expression. Admittedly, her default state stifled a small yawn and mumbled, "It'll be 10 soon," without a glance at any clock or watch.
することもないし、そろそろ寝ましょうか。
It was certainly true that staying up any later wasn't going to accomplish anything. And just being awake with nothing to do would invite unproductive, depressing thoughts. I understood that, but I simply wasn't sleepy. Indifferent to my minor dilemma, Kazuki stood up immediately and opened the zipper dividing the entrance to her tent.
ねえカズキ、
はい。
あなたは不安じゃないの？
ああ、それはいい質問ね。そんなあなたの問いにずっと前から用意しておいた答えがあるのだけれど、バスの事故に遭うことも、こうしてあなたとペアを組むことも、そしてあなたがこの時間にその質問をすることも、私の中では全て想定内よ。どう？一応天才風にかっこよく決めたつもりだったのだけれど。
一応私は真面目な質問をしたつもりなんだけど。
だから私も真面目に答えたじゃない。もう寝ましょう。明日は明日できっとまた忙しくなるだろうし。
With those words, Kazuki dropped to all fours and began to burrow her way into the tent like a bear returning to its den. In a blank daze, I watched Kazuki's round butt wriggling under her skirt as she disappeared inside. I found myself alone, trying and failing to process the meaning of her words.
なんか今のでどっと疲れが出た感じ。
Confronted with the reality of Kazami Kazuki, a girl who looked at first as if she wasn't thinking at all, a girl who kept her thoughts completely unreadable. I found myself feeling ridiculous in comparison, the way I drowned myself in anxious worrying, the way I worked myself into a panic over things I had no control over. Left alone in that dark and silent place, I strained my ears, Hirooka-san's moans, which ate into the heart of the listener, and the voices of laughter, with their grating denial of our danger. Both had stopped for now. The occasional rustling of trees in the wind and the voices of insects were the only sounds left to echo against the walls of rock. The second day went over. That morning, I awoke to the eerie sound of distant birds. I had burrowed into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, fully expecting to lie awake all night, but evidently I must have dozed off at some point. When I first opened my unexpectedly heavy eyelids, I found the interior of our cheap blue tent illuminated by a slanting ray of morning sun. Thankfully, the temperature had risen with the dawn. I must have slept for at least a few hours, but the burden of my fatigue was no lighter. If anything, I felt even more exhausted than I had been the night before. Still wrapped in my sleeping bag, I turned sideways on top of my thin silver mat. Twisting my head toward the other side of the tent, I was surprised to find my roommate missing. Kazuki? Where could she have wandered off to? The mat and sleeping bag Kazuki had been using sat on the ground next to me, neatly tied together in a tight roll. From the look of things, it was unlikely she just stepped out to use the bathroom. Kazuki was clearly already awake and taking action. I crawled outside the tent into a clear sky, but dim morning. The sheer cliffs to our right and left intercepted most of the sun's light. What little reached us filtered down through gaps in the thick vegetation far above. No doubt the same reason it felt oddly chilly for a summer day. Others had already emerged from their tents into the gloomy dawn. Here and there, they sat quietly on the hard stone ground. In addition to the trauma and mental exhaustion of the previous day, we slept in an unfamiliar environment. Not the best way to get rested and refreshed. Most of the berries slept at all, judging from the dark circles under their eyes.
ねえ、和樹を見なかった？
I called out to a freshman from the neighboring tent, Ibuki Haruna, seated some 3 meters away. Ibuki brushed her long bangs out of her eyes with her fingers and responded listlessly.
和樹？ああ、風見さんならシャベルを担いで森の方に行ったからおトイレじゃないかな。
そう。
I turned toward the valley's lone exit. The tangle of vegetation recalled a forest, but Kazuki was nowhere in sight. I did, however, happen to notice someone acting rather oddly a little way off.
ねえ、あれ、何やってるのかな？
そう。
It was Sakuma Minori, a third-year senior. She was a talented athlete, particularly skilled at sinking three-pointers, who'd earned the title of scoring queen in our team. At the moment, she was repeatedly hurling a small object straight up into the air.
気になるなら自分で聞いてきたら？私、あの先輩苦手。
Ibuki didn't bother to lower her voice. She didn't seem to care whether her frank words might reach the ears of our senior. As the result of last night's discussion, she'd been paired with that very Sakuma senpai and was stuck sharing a tent with her for the duration of our stay here. The combination seemed logical enough since Ibuki and Sakuma had been sharing a room as boarder students, but room assignments in the dorm were arbitrary, arranged for the convenience of the school. As in most boarding schools, the freshmen tended to moan about running chores for their arrogant older roommates, while seniors complained about being expected to clean it up after some clueless brat. If you're stuck living in the same room for an extended period of time, the reasonable thing would be to deal with your differences. Find a way to get along, but it seems things aren't that simple, particularly for girls. And the roommates who disliked each other most tended to be exactly the ones who were kept together when rooms were reassigned the next year. It wasn't just coincidence either. From what I'd heard, our school deliberately tried to create awkward combinations as a sneaky way of maintaining discipline. Letting friends clump together naturally leads to cliches and group attempts to skirt the rules. In turn, this can create sharp divisions between those who want peace and quiet in the dorm and those who want to enjoy themselves. Sometimes these would end in nasty squabbles. In other words, the mixing of oil and water personalities in an individual room prevented larger scale problems. Or so I'd heard. As someone who commuted to school, it was a bit hard for me to understand dorm politics.
佐久間先輩、さっきから何をなさってるんですか？
That was a lot of
おお、あまねか。これだこれ。
Sakuma held out the small object she'd been hurling repeatedly into the sky. Specifically, it was her cell phone. She was repeating a simple pattern of action, throwing it straight up with all her might, retrieving it on the way back down, and throwing it right back up again. On closer examination, the body of the phone was battered and covered in fine cracks. She'd probably dropped it numerous times by now.
昨日の夜眠る前に思いついたんだけどね。メールを送信したまま空に投げればうまいこと圏内に入って助けが呼べるんじゃないかなと思ってさ。今朝からずっと試してるんだけど。よっと。
With a fluid overhand motion, Sakuma watched the cell phone into the sky once again.
それ、すごくいいアイデアじゃないですか。
だろ？私もそう思ったんだけど。おっと。
Skillfully catching the cell phone as it plunged back to Earth, she flipped on the screen and checked the status of the transmission.
また失敗か。もう50回ぐらい投げてるけど一度も成功しないよ。やっぱり風見の言う通りなのかもね。
和樹はなんて。
ただでさえ電波が届きにくい環境の上に、もし圏内に投げ込むことができたとしても送信する前に落下してしまえば意味がないってさ。
だったら携帯が戻ってこないように崖の上まで投げちゃえばいいじゃないですか。
私だってそう思ったさ。さっきから投げてるのは崖の上に乗せてしまおうと思って投げてるんだけど届かないんだよ。
ああ。
Although I couldn't tell the exact height of the cliff she was aiming for, a conservative estimate would be 50 meters. That is pretty high, and since the wall sloped over us, some very precise aim would be required.
後で何かうまい方法を考えると風見は言っていたけど、守備よく崖の上に乗せることができたとしても、そこが圏内である保証はないってさ。
Required to land it on top. Kind of the same thing.
そうですか。
I'd hit on the idea of making a crude sling out of a towel or something to throw the phone over the cliff, but it was true enough. There was no evidence we'd be accomplishing anything even if it worked. If there wasn't any signal up there either, we'd end up throwing away a valuable potential means of communication for nothing. And yet, Sakuma was keeping at her task relentlessly, probably mostly for the sake of having something to do. She seemed to know full well that it was essentially hopeless.
それでその和樹を見かけませんでしたか？
風見ならさっき大きなシャベルを抱えて森に入っていったよ。30分ぐらい前かな。トイレにしては長いね。
ちょっと私様子を見に行ってこようかと思います。
気をつけた方がいいよ。さっき私も森に入ってみたんだけど、道なんてどこにもないし、周りは木ばっかりで目印がないからすぐに迷う。何か分かりやすい目印をつけながら行った方がいい。
はい、わかりました。気をつけます。
It had already been half an hour since Kazuki entered the forest. Definitely way too long for a bathroom break. It was hard to imagine Kazami Kazuki, of all people, making such a careless blunder, but there was a possibility she lost her bearings and wandered in the wrong direction. I cautiously made my way into the forest, using the blade of a can opener to mark tree trunks with arrows as I went. I tried shouting her name, but there was no reply. I studied the ground at my feet. Although crushed vegetation made it clear that some of us had been in this area recently, the trails were indistinct, not that I could tell which belonged to Kazuki in the first place. When I glanced behind me, I found the route I trampled through the high grass was still very clear by comparison. Surprisingly, however, it was a meandering zigzag, probably the result of constantly winding my way around trees. I thought I was walking perfectly straight, too. This is what makes the wilderness a truly terrifying place. I thought I had a pretty good sense of the dangers of wild mountains from books and comics, but now that I was actually experiencing one, I was quickly coming to realize how badly mistaken I'd been. I'd gone in believing that getting lost in the woods would generally work out for the best, so long as you reacted appropriately. That naive thought dissolved in mere minutes inside the jungle. In an environment utterly barren of any trace or of other human beings, your sense of isolation quickly builds into anxiety. It becomes easy to rush into action based on unfounded, optimistic assumptions. It's got to be this way. It was probably over there. Shying away from acknowledging the worst case scenario, running around on your intuition alone, you become truly and hopelessly lost. In time, your anxiety reaches a new stage. Am I simply wasting my energy wandering around in circles? And even worse fear, because it's paralyzing. You're frozen where you stand, trapped with your own slowly escalating terror. And eventually, the fear of death creeps up on you, breaking your courage and robbing you of reason. In the end, just such an outcome is entirely likely.
Kazuki!
It hadn't been 10 minutes since I entered the forest, and I could already feel myself trembling. I'd begun to sink into the first stage, powerful anxiety at my own isolation. I screamed Kazuki's name for the second time, a little louder than before. Maybe it would be smarter to return for now, while I still know the way back, then launch an organized search with someone else. But just as these thoughts were running through my head, I heard the rustling sound of someone stepping their way through the high grass a few paces behind me. My body went stiff with shock. I spun around to find that Kazami Kazuki had materialized out of nowhere, the usual vaguely sleepy expression on her face.
人の名前をあまり大きな声で叫ばないでもらえる？ファンに取り囲まれたら面倒じゃない。そう、風見和樹よ。サインが欲しいのならマネージャーを通して事務所に色紙を送ってちょうだい。
何？色
紙？いや、だからここであなたはアイドル気取りかって突っ込んでくれないとボケゾンってやつじゃない。
あ、そうか、ごめん。
いいわよ別に。それほど面白い冗談だとも思ってなかったし。
和樹、どこに行ってたの？
トイレよ。一人でゆっくり用を足すこともできないなんて、まさにアイドルのようだと思ったから口にした冗談だったのだけれど。
トイレにしては遅いじゃない。30分も頑張ってたの？
ついでだから食べられそうな草を摘んでいたのよ。ほら。
Kazuki had out some small, unfamiliar vegetables. They seemed to be immature shoots of some leafy plant.
山菜でも生えていればと思って探してみたけれど、こんなものしか見つからなかったわ。
何それ、食べられるの？
草ソテツのわかめよ。一応生でも食べられるけど、おひたしとかにした方がいいわね。
へえ、こんなの初めて見た。あんまり美味しそうじゃないけど。
ろくな食べ物がないから、それらを餌にする野生動物も当然いない。鳥の声はするけど、その姿は見えない。熊に襲われる心配がないのはありがたいけれど、改めてひどい環境だと思い知ったわ。とりあえず朝食はこれで済ませましょう。調理法は任せるけど、調味料の類はできるだけ節約して。
食材ならまだじゃがいもも人参も残ってるけど。
日持ちのするものはできるだけ残しておきたいの。3日でここを脱出できるとは限らないのだし。
そっか、そうだよね。
そんなにがっかりしないで。確かに絶望的ではあるけれど、助からないと決まったわけではないから。
私たち助かるの？
どうかしら。別にはぐらかすわけではないけれど、さすがの私にも。
私たちが助かる方法ってあるの？
あるわよ。
どんな方法？何？あるんでしょ？方法が。
あるにはあるけれど、まだ無理。
無理って ういう意味？
今の私たちでは実現不可能という意味よ。
ごめん、私バカだから意味がわからない。今は無理ってどういうこと？時間が経てば可能になるってこと？
そういうこと。それに救助が来る可能性もまだ残っているし、今はただじっと耐えるしかないわ。
ねえ、どんな方法なの？ヒントだけでも教えてよ。
人間が死なないために必要なものってなんだ？
水？
あ、思い出した。さっき草を摘んでいる時、湧き水が湧いている場所を見つけたの。というわけで飲み水の心配は不要よ。
なんだ、お水か。
そうがっかりしたものでもないわよ。水があれば1週間は生きられるもの。部長にはあなたが発見したって報告してくれる？
それは構わないけど。
じゃあ戻りましょうか。
待って、私まだヒントの答え聞いてないよ。人間が生きていくのに必要なものって何？
食べ物よ。
食べ物？それが助かるためのヒント？
そういうこと。だからできるだけ接触しておく必要があるの。
それでみんなが助かるの？
全員が助かるとは一言も言ってないでしょ。もう戻りましょう。あまり遅くなるとみんなが心配するわ。
カズキ！
大丈夫よ。帰り道は完璧に覚えているから。私についてきなさい。
待ってよ、カズキ！
わお、すごい剣幕ね。何をそんなに怒っているの？
ワオじゃないわよ。全員は助からないってどういう意味？
そういう可能性もあるという意味よ。早い段階で救助が来ればもちろん全員助かるわ。
じゃあもし救助が来なかったら？
それはその時に考えればいいことよ。編成された救助隊の捜索が打ち切られるのは早くて5日、遅くても14日。1週間経っても救助が来なければその時に考えましょう、みんなで。そんなに心配しなくてもあなたはかなりの確率で生き残るはずよ。
どんな根拠で？
そんなの決まっているでしょ。私のパートナーに選ばれたからよ。
本気で言ってるのそれ？
もちろん本気です。さて、質問は以上かしら？よろしい。では戻りましょう。
もう勝手にズンズン行かないで。
面倒な子ね。不安だから手をつないでほしいのならはっきりとそう言いなさいの。
別にそういうわけじゃ。
あらそう。じゃあいいのね、手をつながなくて。
つなぐ？
はい、お声が遠いのですが。
つなぎます。手をつながせてください、和樹様。
あら、いい子ね。いらっしゃい、あまねちゃん。
もうこれからは勝手に一人で行動しないで。私心配したんだよ。
あなたが私を？
そりゃさ、私ごときがおこがましいとは思うけど。
いえ、そういう意味ではなくて、むしろ私を心配してくれる人がいることに驚いたというか。でもそうね、ごめんなさい。そんな顔しないで。まるで母親に置いていかれた子供みたいな顔じゃない。 大丈夫。あなたを置いてどこにも行きはしないから。
約束？
ええ、約束するわ。さ、戻ります。
Since I was physically sturdy, I was usually the one being relied on by others. But at that moment, I realized I'd grown totally dependent on that diminutive girl, Kazuki. I wasn't used to leaning on others like a crutch. Clinging to someone usually made me feel more awkward than anything else. But that day, the distinct warmth of Kazuki's small hand was very reassuring.
冷たい手をしているのね、アマネ。
ごめん。
いいのよ。私の母親もこんな感じの手だから。
私のことお母さんって呼んでもいいのよ。
あら、言うようになったわね。
Kazuki guided me by the hand back out of the forest. When we returned to the camp, we found everyone gathered in front of the tents, discussing plans for the future and proposing escape strategies. Of course, we were students from a school for rich young ladies, with only the superficial appearance of maturity. Producing a perfect smile for a polite good day was the extent of the practical, non-academic knowledge we gained there. As such experience wasn't exactly of much use here. The majority of the ideas were unrealistic, founded on the assumption the world would arrange itself for our convenience. If anything, it could be called good fortune that a few halfway decent sounding thoughts were mixed in. For example, Sakuma's throwing a cell phone into the sky. However, the majority of these more worthwhile plans had already been tried out by the person who brought them up, all with little success. In this life-and-death situation, everyone tossed out any idea that popped into their head, grasping at straws in a desperate search for hope. But when someone proposed we capture a bird and wrap a letter around its leg asking for help, Captain Sakashita finally lost her temper at the sheer absurdity.
あなたたち、少しは真面目に考えたらどうなの？
そんな、私たちだって必死に考えて。
必死に考えてその程度なの。小学生だってもう少しまともな意見を口にするわよ。それとも何？この次はどうやって鳥を捕まえるかという議題で話し合うつもり？
何もそんな言い方しなくたってねえ。確かに一番必死なのは坂下かもね。
私たちよりまともな意見があるなら言えばいいのに。
The stage whispers of her critics naturally reached Captain Sakashita's ears as they were intended to.
あなたたち、言いたいことがあるならはっきりと言いなさいな。そんな陰口のように恥ずかしくはないの？
Captain Sakashita's irritated, impatient tone was no different from her usual scoldings during practice. But at that moment, we weren't in that usual situation, tucked away in our safe gymnasium. It was a life-or-death emergency, and everyone was frantic. At such times, people instinctively seek out someone to rely on. The more desperate the situation, the more we throw aside rank and title and turn to raw competence. It felt like many gazes were beginning to concentrate in Kazuki's general direction. I don't think it was just my imagination. Captain Sakashita seemed to have noticed as well. Swallowed by what looked like an overwhelming surge of irritation, she abruptly grabbed a nearby fist-sized outcropping of rock, then squeezed it so hard her fingers turned white. This isn't good. We weren't going to achieve anything by continuing this attack on Captain Sakashita, and I think we all knew that. Even so, I understood the temptation to create a scapegoat, the irrational feeling that pushing all the bitterness and blame onto another would wipe away our own shortcomings, as if doing so would save us somehow. For most of the team members, the captain had become the scapegoat, and for the captain, it must have been Kazuki who filled that role. As the main authority figure, our advisor, Mr. Ochi, probably should have interceded by now, but he seemed intent on staying out of the conversation under the pretext of attending to the wounded. He'd never made a habit of intervening in the team's quarrels, a policy typical of teachers at all female schools, who know full well what a nuisance it is to get caught in the crossfire of a girl squabble. Schoolgirl squabble. His normal approach was to smooth things over with the individuals involved after the fight died down. He was probably assuming that would be enough this time as well. What should we do? Not that I really have grounds to criticize his passivity. In the end, I glanced pleadingly at Kazuki out of the corner of my eye, hoping she would rescue us from this ugly situation. Apparently reading my mind from that small movement, Kazuki let out a short, resigned sigh, then slowly opened her mouth to speak.
もうその辺にしておきなさい。バカを相手に喧嘩をする人が一番バカよ。
その言葉、私に言ったの？それとも彼女たちに？
みんなに言ったのよ。あなたにはどう聞こえた？
そういうあなたはさっきからずっと黙っているようだけど、何かいいアイデアはないのかしら？
おとなしく救助を待つという提案が一番最初に決まったはずですが。
何もしないでただ救助を待つというの？いつ来るかもわからない救助を。
いつ来るかわからないから無駄に体力を消耗したくないのです。幸いなことにスオさんのおかげで水源は確保できたことですし、接触すればしばらくは持ちこたえられますが、それとも。
Kazuki covered her mouth with her hand and narrowed her eyes in apparent amusement.
それとも、以前私が申し上げたように、一か八かの賭けに出て、あの密林に足を踏み入れて脱出を試みますか？
As she spoke, Kazuki jerked her head in the direction of the overgrown, humid jungle sealing our only exit from the valley. Even from a distance, the tangled mass of plants exuded the indifferentness of nature.
それは。
The captain had emphatically shot down the suggestion only yesterday. Overturning that decision now was probably impossible. Cold sweat forming at my temples, I watched nervously as the captain's face changed color to an extremely disturbing shade of red, but in the next moment, Kazuki shot me a quick, suggestive glance. Oh, I get it. I abruptly jerked my hand into the air as if requesting a teacher's attention in the classroom.
よろしいでしょうか？
何かしら、スオさん。
やっぱり部長がおっしゃったように、うかつに森に入るのは危険だと思います。
それはもう誰もが理解していることよ。
ですからとりあえず1週間この場で思いつく限りのアイデアを試しながら救助を待つというのはどうでしょう？
どうして1週間なの？
この手の遭難事故の場合、だいたい2週間で捜索が打ち切られるそうです。ですから1週間待ってみて救助が来ない場合は、その時にまたこちらから行動を起こすアイデアを話し合いましょう。
それを今話し合っているのでしょ？あなた何を言っているの？
それは
どうして1週間後にも今日と同じ体力が残っていると思えるのかしら。不思議。
何ですって？
I turned my head slightly to the side and shot Kazuki a brief glare, not that she even noticed, judging from her unruffled, perfectly indifferent expression.
いや、でもまあつまりはそういう、とにかく1週間思いつく限りの手段で SOS を発信しながら救助を待って、それでも救助が来なかったら、その時の体力や食料事情に応じた対策を話し合いましょう。
まあいいわ。 確かに今はそれぐらいしかできることもなさそうだし。それでよろしいですね、先生。
ああ、とりあえずはそれでいいだろ
う。では最後に私からの忠告です。各自アイデアを出して実行するのは構いませんが、決して無茶のない範囲で行動するように。崖に足場を掘りながらよじ登るとか、そういった危険が伴うアイデアはくれぐれも実行しないように。以上。
With those clipped words of warning, the discussion finally ended, taking with it the tension that had hung thick in the air for so long. The rest of the group quickly broke up into their assigned pairs, whispering furtively to each other as they walked away from the meeting place. Of course, I was no exception. As Kazuki promptly stood up from her seat and made to leave, I chased after her and immediately offered a few words of employment.
ちょっと、さっきのはひどくない？
あら、何のこと？
また私に重要な発言を丸投げしたでしょ。私、和樹の腹話術人形じゃないんだからね。
変ね。私、あなたに何か言えと命令した覚えは全くないのだけれど。
言わなくてもわかるわよ。それに目で合図したじゃない。
ええ、確かに合図は送ったけれど、まさかああも敏感に感じ取ってもらえるとは思ってもいなかったから、私もう嬉しくて。今日は一日ニコニコしていると思うけど、気持ち悪いとか思われないか心配だわ。
なんかいろんな意味で気持ち悪いのは確かね。
あまね、私はあなたがとても気に入ったわ。もし私が男なら間違いなくあなたにプロポーズしているわよ。
やめてよ、私そっちの趣味ないし。
ええ、大丈夫。私にも今のところそっちの趣味はないから。
今のところって。
Is she implying there's a chance she'll swing that way in the future?
まあ、絶対にないとは言えないわね。
だから私の心を先読みして会話をしないでよ。
何にせよ、あなたのおかげで話がうまくまとまったのだから1000の感謝を送りたいわ。
はあ、さいですか。そりゃよござんしたね。
それでもやはり残る懸念はあの部長ね。やっぱり私、あの子が嫌いだわ。
はっきり言うな。確かにちょっと上から目線が鼻につくけど、基本的に悪い先輩ではないと思うけど。
While her tone tended to be harsh, her directions during practice were appropriate and reasonable, and she cared more about the members of her team than you might assume. Currently, she was in a far more taxing situation than captaining a school team could have possibly prepared her for. Taking that into consideration, you could say she was coping fairly calmly.
確かにそうかもしれない。でも仮にも部という一つの組織をまとめる長なのだから、せめてブレインストーミングぐらいは理解していてほしいのだけれど。ブレインストーミングよ。
何それ。
ググりなさい。
は？
説明が面倒な時の合言葉よ。でもまあそうね。通信手段が途絶している今この場では酷な言葉ね。まあ簡単に説明してしまうと4つの原則があるの。
はあ。
1、決めつけない。2、否定せずに何でも受け入れる。3、とにかく数を出す。4、結合する。つまりどんなにくだらない意見でも否定せずにとりあえず聞いてみて。一見して無駄のように思える意見でも他の意見と組み合わせることで有効な意見にできないかを考える。それがブレインストーミングよ。
おお、なんか天才っぽい。
茶化さないの。結構真面目な話をしているのだから。
ごめん。それで？
さっきの話し合いで彼女は他人の意見に否定をぶつけるだけで何一つ建設的な意見は口にしなかったでしょ。そう、例えば火を起こしてのろしを上げるとか、いっそ森に火をつけるとか、そんな意見に彼女は何て答えたかしら。
それは確かもう試してみて効果がなかったんじゃなかったっけ。のろしの煙は重なった木々の枝で分散されちゃうし、山火事の場合は冬場ならともかく今の季節は森自体の湿度が高くてジメジメしてるから無理だって。
そう。他にはどんな意見があったかしら。
次はメール送信状態の携帯電話を崖の上。
それも佐久間先輩が何度も試して失敗しているわね。他は？
テントのシートを材料にしてタコを作ってあげるとか、鳥を捕まえて足に手紙を結びつけるとか。
あら、何か思いついた？
タコに携帯電話を結びつけて空にあげるってどうかな。
そうね、試してみる価値はあると思うわ。
さっきの話し合いではそんなこと思いつかなかったのに。
あれもダメ、これもダメと否定するだけの話し合いに意味なんてないわ。くだらない意見も全て受け入れた上で、その中から複数のアイデアを組み合わせて新しい意見を考える。そういう発想があればあの話し合いも無駄ではなかったはずなんだけどね。
どうしてあの場でそれを言わなかったの？
だってまた余計なことを言って怒られたら嫌じゃない。それに物の考え方の価値って人に教わるより自分で気がついた方がずっと高級だと思わない？
例えばタコに携帯電話を結びつけて飛ばすアイデアとか。
ええ、そう。そのひらめきが脳を活性化させるの。
やっぱりあなたは最初から答えが分かっていて私に思いつかせるように会話で誘導したのね。
そういうものの捉え方は心外だわ。それともあなたは学校で数式を習っても同じように教師に噛みつくの？
今の私たちと学校での私たちじゃ置かれている状況が違うわ。
何でも教えてくれる人が身近にいると自分では考えることをしなくなる。そういう観点で見れば同じことよ。
私、あなたのそういう回りくどいところが少し苦手。
気をつけるわ。
I felt like I was beginning to understand why my conversations with Kazuki sometimes felt slightly off. The discussions I had with this girl reminded me strongly of a classroom dialogue between a teacher and a student. She never revealed the answers immediately, instead dropping vague, indirect hints. She clearly regarded those with no desire to learn as unworthy of her wisdom. In other words, very much like a veteran professor, an aging department head with a knowing smile. If Kazuki deigned to consider the matter seriously, might she be able to find a way out of this whole mess in the blink of an eye? The more I thought about it, the more these little lessons of Kazuki seemed like an indirect way of rubbing my nose in my inferiority. The implied message was, "You're incompetent." Frankly, it kind of annoyed me. I mean, very angry. And since I really was incompetent, I couldn't come up with any biting comebacks, which annoyed me even worse. I had an itching desire to show her up somehow, but what could I possibly hope to defeat her at? Right. If nothing else, I'm probably a better cook. Yeah, there was a pretty good chance I could teach her a lesson or two in that arena. I latched onto that trifling point of superiority, imagining Kazuki fumbling around helplessly in the kitchen under my dry supervision. Jeez, you're all thumbs, Kazuki, and all that. Before I knew it, there was a smile on my face. All of a sudden, this aggravating young woman looked like a cute little girl. I was slightly exasperated at my own simple-mindedness. I quickly put the culinary skills in question to use whipping up our meager breakfast. As Kazuki and I were choking it down, I ended up telling her about that little daydream.
その単純さこそが人が自殺をしないためのシステムよ。
She responded with these pretty much incomprehensible sentences, that and a gentle smile. What the heck is with this girl anyway? Well, whatever. I'd finished my breakfast. It hadn't exactly filled my stomach and inspired a burst of energy for the day to come, but I nonetheless decided to take a little positive action by proposing the kite cell phone idea to the captain.
"あなたもなの?"
どういう意味です？
そのアイデアを私のところに持ち込んだのはあなたが初めてではないという意味よ。10分ぐらい前に金田小森のペアが来て試させてほしいって言ってきたの。
あ、そうなんですか。
Yeah, I guess anybody could come up with that one.
同じ実験を2つすることに意味はないし、他のアイデアを思いついたらまた来なさい。
はあ、わかりました。
I'd been feeling a little proud of myself for coming up with a pretty decent idea. For some reason, it felt as though that achievement had been pulled out from under me. I trudged back to the tent, my shoulders drooping, and told Kazuki about the outcome. There was another pair that had hit on the exact same idea. Of course, Kaneda and Komori had participated in the same discussion and had the same information to work from. It wasn't that strange a coincidence. Indeed, Kazuki showed no surprise whatsoever. Quite the opposite. She nodded her head with the words, I figure as much. From what she told me, something called reminiscence was likely at work here.
レミニセンスというのはつまり情報を得た直後より一定の時間が経過してからの方が記憶の関連付けが進行する分早期や連結発想がしやすくなるという現象ね。
また難しい話をしようとしている？
そうね。専門的な話をすると長くなるし、やめておきましょう。
ぜひそうしてください。
それで何か他のアイデアは思いついた？
タコをあげて発見してもらうというのは他者の視覚に訴えかける通信、つまり光媒体の通信だよね。
ええ、そうね。
携帯電話を使うのはそのまま電波通信でしょ？
はん、つまりそういうこと？
もしかして私が今から言おうとしたこともう分かっちゃった？
音による通信の可能性？
なんだ、やっぱりバレてた。
いいえ、私も今あなたの話で気がついたのよ。つまりバスのクラクションを鳴らすとか、そういった聴覚に訴えかける大音量装置による通信でしょ？
うん、そうそう、そんな感じ。
まさかとは思うけど、みんなで大きな声で叫ぶとか考えていたわけではないわよね。
それは
考えていたんだ。
はいはい、考えてましたよ。どうせ私はアホですよ。
発想の着眼点は悪くないわよ。 誰かに先を越される前に部長に報告してみたら？
一応報告はするけど、きっと私でなくても誰かが思いつくアイデアよね。
言ったでしょ、そういった小さな発想の積み重ねが新しいアイデアにつながるのよ。
まあそれはわかるんだけどね。一つ思いついたらすぐに報告ってのもなんか頭悪いかなって。
だったらもう一つアイデアを用意したら？例えばそうね、あまり現実味はないけれど発想の一つとしてデジタル通信の可能性とかはどうかしら？
デジタル通信？
例えばそう、森に行ってこう長い木の枝を何本も集めて、それを縦に連結していけば理論上は何百メートルだろうと長い棒が作れるでしょ。その長い棒の一端を私たちが掴んで、右に回転させれば0、左に回転させれば1とすれば二進法のデジタル信号が送れるでしょ。
なんかカズキにしては割とバカっぽいアイデアだよね、それ。
そうかしら。質量はともかく重量の制限を受けない宇宙空間でならタイムラグのない超長距離高速通信に応用できそうなネタだと思うけど、ダメ？
ダメっていうか、宇宙ってなんだろうな、やっぱなんとかと天才って紙一重なんだね。今思い知った感じ。
だから発想の元というか、あくまでも着眼点の一つとして報告してみてはどうかしらというプロポーズなのだけれど。
まあそうね、そういう考え方もあるって感じで報告してみるけど、バカだと思われたら嫌だな。
あなた、それは私に対して何気に失礼よ。
After that, I offered the captain my second idea and received a very positive evaluation of worth looking into. I did give a half-hearted mention of the possibility of digital communication as well, but as anticipated, the captain's reaction was unenthusiastic. The concept clearly didn't quite click with her either, and I was left with a vague permission for experiments within the range of common sense. Well, the proposed experiment just involved gathering long sticks and trying to bind them together, so at least failure wouldn't be a complete waste of effort. We'd have secured ourselves a supply of firewood, if nothing else. That said, the first priority was looking into the more realistic possibility of communication through sound. In other words, examining the rooms of the bus and seeing if the horn was still functional. As a matter of fact, I had a bit of knowledge about motor vehicles. I'd liked cars ever since I was a young child. Back in the day, I loved tagging along with my dad to the market every morning in our mini truck. I guess my somewhat tomboyish fascination with cars amused my dad. He used to let me sit on his lap and drive around and around the place for the fun of it. Of course, I'd gotten a little old for that, but I never lost my curiosity about automobiles. I picked up a bit of knowledge about how they function. Crawling through the broken rear window, I made my way into the overturned bus once again. Inside, the smell of leaking fuel had grown noticeably thicker in the air. After slowly and carefully making my way the length of the bus, I reached the driver's seat to find the key still seated in the ignition. But the cylinder had been firmly turned to the off position. Come to think of it, that was my doing. When I dragged Mr. Ochi from the driver's seat, I found the eerie glow of the dashboard backlight so creepy that I immediately switched it off. Clutching the key tightly, I said a small prayer to no one in particular, then twisted it to on. The dashboard sprung immediately to life, and I heard the distinctive stirring of the fuel pump motor. Apparently, the battery was still alive. Must have been a dry cell, with the vehicle sideways like this. The liquid electrolytes would have leaked out of a wet battery. I was tempted to keep turning the key to start, but the engine was probably a lost cause. I'd just be wasting precious battery juice in the attempt. First off, I was here to test whether the horn was operational. I gave the center of the steering wheel a light push with the palm of my hand, and a surprisingly loud blast of sound ripped
よ
through
か
the
っ
air.
た。まだ鳴る。
At the sudden sound, everyone in the valley turned as one to stare in my direction. For the moment, I confirmed the horn was operational. Now we had to consider how to make effective use of it. Just blasting away aimlessly would run down the battery quickly, so it seemed necessary to discuss how and when we should utilize it. Turning the ignition back to off for now, I cautiously made my way back out of the bus.
クラクション使えるみたいね。
そうだね。あとはどのタイミングで鳴らすかってのが問題かな。いくら鳴らしてもそれを聞きつけて救助を呼んでくれる人がそばにいなければまるで意味がないし。
まずは音という要素を一つ確保したというところで満足するべきね。それをそのまま使うのか、それとも他の何かと組み合わせて使うのか、その辺は今後考えていきましょう。
I turned around and looked up in the direction of the road. At a guess, it was perhaps 200 meters distant from the bottom of the ravine we were trapped in. The sound of our horn would probably carry that far. Look at all of them just working together to survive right now. It's really cool. But how are we supposed to know if someone was up there at any given moment? That was the biggest problem with this idea. From that distance, a car could be rumbling fairly noisily down the road, and we likely wouldn't notice. I couldn't immediately think of anything other than the passive strategy of honking the horn at regular intervals in the hope of coincidence.
「捜索隊のヘリでも飛んできてくれれば分かりやすいんだけどな。」
ヘリコプターだと逆に自分の出す音が大きすぎてこちらの出す音に気がつかないんじゃないかしら。
そうか。あ、音がダメなら光はヘッドライトを取り外して空に向けて点灯してみたらどうかな。
いいアイデアだとは思うけど。
Turning back and following Kazuki's gaze, I quickly discovered why she trailed off mid-sentence. After tumbling down the slopes 200 meters in length, finally plunging into a pit-like valley, the bus resembled a gigantic piece of gum chewed up and spat out by a dinosaur. The roof was caved in, the windows were all broken, and the headlights and turn signals were no exception to the general rule. Everyone was smashed beyond repair. Everyone.
ダメか。
室内灯とかテールランプの一つも生き残っていれば何かの役に立つかもしれないし、調べてみましょう。
うん、そうだね。
Kazuki and I divided the job of searching the wreckage of the bus for potentially useful items, but the noticeably important things had already been carried out. The only new discoveries were a few discarded magazines and a slightly dirty blanket that had been used as cushioning in the luggage compartment, as well as a small metal box containing a bare handful of tools and a single fire extinguisher probably designed for use against vehicle fires. Nothing to write home about, in other words. I had tried to go in without much in the way of expectations, but there was definitely a part of me clinging to the faint hope of discovering something. An armful of canned food and some unexplored nook of the luggage compartment would have sent me back to camp jumping for joy. When that hope was dashed, the disappointment hit me harder than I expected.
ねえカズキ、私たちどうなるのかな。
その質問、今日だけで4回目よ。そして私は毎回同じ答えを口にしている。
なるようにしかならないし、なんとでもなるから今はただ希望を捨てずにできることをしなさいだよね。分かってはいるんだけど、どうしてもね。
For now, we simply do what we can, In those words, there was a slight glimmer of optimism, the suggestion that at some undefined later we would escape. But that vague hope was too slippery to cling on to. I couldn't see anything but overwhelming, unpredictable reality. The anxiety and uncertainty was almost too much to bear. It felt as though someone had suddenly dropped an enormous whale in front of me and told me to fillet it with a single fruit knife. Holding back tears, I was thrusting my tiny blade into thick, unyielding blubber, tormented by a sense of all futility, doubtful I was accomplishing anything at all. Just waiting for someone to tell me, it's impossible, just give up. In such a situation, I couldn't help but sink into pessimism and passivity. Is help coming? When will they arrive? What if they never find us? Can we possibly escape on our own? Can we possibly survive this? I knew full well that anguishing over such unanswerable questions accomplished nothing, but before I realized it, they were oozing out from the dark corners of my mind. Is this another one of those involuntarily psychological defense mechanisms designed to push us through life? When I asked Kazuki, she shook her head and told me flat out, no, that's probably just your personality. During the time we spent in the bus, Kaneda and Komori apparently completed their kite. Everyone left their personal projects behind for a while and gathered to watch the launch. The string they'd used was a slender fishing line taken from the tackle box. Its tensile strength was a point of concern, so it was decided to run an initial test flight without the cell phone attached. The length of the line was about 100 meters, leaving aside the cell phone part of the plan. If we could get it up that high, someone might notice it from the road. But as it turned out, well, reality isn't quite that convenient. It was, after all, a kite made by a bunch of amateurs from rough visual memory. There wasn't any realistic chance it would soar beautifully into the sky. After many failed launches, the makeshift kite ended up crashing into the ground and falling to pieces. To be perfectly honest, everyone gathered there had been more or less expecting as much from the very start, even the girls who constructed it. The failure didn't inspire any wailing or gnashing of teeth. Even if it had floated up perfectly, there was still the lid of trees hanging thickly over this valley. Weaving even a well-constructed kite up through the gaps in the canopy without tangling it hopelessly in the branches would clearly have been very difficult. Even so, Kaneda and Komori said they'd give it another shot, and immediately began repairing their broken kite, but apparently the general feeling was that nothing more was going to come of this. Everyone left them alone with their mangled construction and headed back to their own stations. This is not looking good. Bye.